A very good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen. You are all very welcome to this morning's webinar, the new EU Forest Strategy for 2030. What will it mean for Ireland? Organised by the European Commission representation in Ireland in cooperation with ourselves here in European Movement Ireland. My name is Noelle O'Connell and I'm the CEO of EM Ireland, and I am delighted to be the moderator for this morning's event. So what are we here to talk about today? Well, the new EU Forest Strategy, it's part of the flagship initiative of the EU Green Deal, which aims to help the EU achieve important environmental targets, such as reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030 and to reach climate neutrality in the EU by 2050. So really ambitious climate targets. And overall, this new EU Forest Strategy is designed to protect and restore forests across the EU, which are, I think this audience will certainly agree, one of Europe's natural heritage treasures, and they play a vital role in tackling climate change and biodiversity loss. So for today's European Commission Forestry webinar, and to help us explore the new strategy, we have a fantastic panel of speakers. And joined this morning, firstly, from, I believe, a very sunny Brussels, Marco Onida of DG Environment at the European Commission, and representing the environmental pillar, Andrew St. Ledger, and Mark McAuley, Director of Forest Industries Ireland. So a very warm welcome to you all this morning. So in terms of the running order and the format for today's event, all three speakers have been invited to share their thoughts on the strategy. And then we will move on to a Q&A session with those of you tuning in today. And I'm absolutely delighted, and I've given a friendly warning to our distinguished panel of speakers. We have over 15 questions in so far from various commentators and speakers, so a fantastic level of interest in this morning's webinar. So please do continue to submit your questions for the panel by emailing events@europeanmovement.ie. And of course, we encourage all attendees to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag EUForests. And please use the handles at EU Ireland and at EM Ireland. So with that out of the way, with that housekeeping virtually done out of the way, it is my pleasure to invite our first speaker this morning to give us his remarks and his thoughts. And we are delighted to be joined by Marco Onida. And Marco is a senior expert in forest protection and bioeconomy at the Director General for Environment at the European Commission. Marco joined the European Commission in 1994 and specialises in EU environmental law. Marco, a very warm and Irish welcome to you this morning, and it is my pleasure to invite you to take the virtual floor. Marco.
Good morning everybody from a rather cloudy, soon rainy Brussels. Thank you very much to the European Movement Ireland and the European Commission office in Dublin for this great opportunity. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here, although virtually I have been involved quite a lot in the past months on issues of Irish forests, been myself in Ireland. This summer I've also just finished reading a beautiful book called Saving Eden by Kevin Corcoran that tells everything about Irish forests. It's really something that was really instructive. So I'm here to give you a few words of introduction, explanation about what this new EU forest strategy is. This is my role today in this 8 to 10 minutes. First of all, let me say that this new EU forest strategy is the result of a cooperation. Actually, it's adopted by the European Commission. That means it's a collegial work, but it was produced jointly by three services of the European Commission, DG Environment that I represent, DG Climate Action, and DG Agriculture. So it's a result of an incentive joint work. If we can just move to the next slide. As Noelle was saying before, the new EU forest strategy is a delivery of the European Green Deal. The European Green Deal is the first priority of the current European Commission, headed by President von der Leyen, is a new EU growth model for reaching a sustainable society with climate neutrality by 2020. And it builds also on the EU biodiversity strategy that was adopted in 2020, and that sets very clear objectives for biodiversity protection for 2030. If we can move to the next. The core of the EU forest strategy, there are three pillars, the economic, the social, and the environmental function of forests. So it's very important, the principle of multifunctionality approach, the contribution of foresters, forest managers, forest owners to the entire forest-based value chain for achieving this sustainable and climate neutral economy. At the same time, ensuring the protection of forest ecosystems, and forests have to be resilient and adequately protected if they have to continue fulfilling the function, the multifunctions that we want them to do. And then focus on adequate forest monitoring and strategic planning for the future. If we can move to the next. First, this is the socio-economic dimension of the forest strategy, with four main pillars: promotion of the sustainable forest bioeconomy, in particular for long-lived wood products, with a focus on particular on construction products and buildings, ensuring that in case wood is used for bioenergy, this is done under very strict condition and improved, enhanced sustainability conditions for the use, for the protection of our forest ecosystems. Then very important, the promotion of the so-called non-wood forest-based bioeconomy. So the services that forests provide to society should also be rewarded, and in particular, ecotourism has been identified as one of these avenues. And then a whole strand of actions and proposals in order to improve skills and education in the world of forest and forestry. We can move to the next. On to the next, there is these slides. I wouldn't have time to go through everything. They highlight the different deliverables planned in the forest strategy. In this case, as I mentioned, the focus on buildings, for instance, developing a roadmap for reducing whole life cycle carbon emissions. We can move to the next one, which is the environmental pillar. This is also a long list. This will be made available, I believe. So for those who want to see all the deliverables, these slides, you can check yourself later. If we move to the next one, you see the environmental pillar. And here I mentioned already the protection of forests, in particular, the protection of the last remaining primary and old growth forests in the EU. This is less than 3% of EU forest. We're working towards a definition of old growth forests together with the member states, ensuring the restoration and sustainable forest management for climate adaptation and forest resilience. That means making sure that when we talk about a sustainably managed forest, we know what it means. We have to enhance the concept of sustainable forest management, and we have to ensure that forests which are degraded are restored. There is a request by the European Green Deal already to improve European forests, their extent and their quality. So there is a huge afforestation plan which is planned in the forest strategy, and then how to reach all these objectives with a number of ideas on possible financial incentives and uptake of funds that that people could use in order to fulfill these targets. If we can move on, we can see, as we did before, a list of deliverables. As I mentioned, the strict protection of all the primary old growth forests, indicators for sustainable forest management, guidelines on biodiversity-friendly afforestation and reforestation that will be ready at the beginning of 2022, and then guidelines on the so-called closer to nature forestry, with a view to achieve a possible certification, a voluntary certification, a bit what it is done for biopharma products. Those who manage forests in a closer to nature way should also be rewarded by way of a label or certification. If we move on to the next, as I mentioned, financial incentives. Here there are a bunch of ideas. In particular, the concept around which these ideas are centered is the concept of payment for ecosystem services. So forests are not just producing wood, but they're producing a number of services to society: oxygen, water, cultural services, and so recreational. So all these should be rewarded and the EU is studying the possibility to enhance the mechanism so that that forest can be rewarded for having their forest protected. Another thing that we are envisaging is to identify the possibility to improve the state aid rules to use them better when it comes to support services which are beneficial to the public. If we move on to the next one, please. Here, this is what I mentioned in the beginning, the strategic forest monitoring dimension, monitoring, reporting, and observation and data collection. We have a lot of forest research and observation, but it's done in a rather patchy form across the countries. There is no real uniform harmonization of definitions and methods, and that, in a way, limits the possibility to have information in real time about the state of forest. So if you move to the next, we see that we propose an initiative, a legislative initiative, to have a regulation or a directive. Next slide, please. Where the subject of which would be reporting, observation, and data collection to ensure a coordinated EU forest management, monitoring, data collection, and reporting system, and strategic planning by member states at the level that they wish to do it. Could be regional, could be national, on what they aim at with their forests. Next, please. We aim quickly to the end, so we stay within the 10 minutes. There are a few enabling elements, research, new governance for cooperation between the Commission, the member states among themselves, and then, of course, improving the implementation of the EU acquis legislation. There is still a dimension of sometimes non-compliance with legislation that needs to be tackled. Next, please. I will just finish with the afforestation plan. The EU has launched the plan to plant 3 billion additional trees by 2030. Next, please. Identifying that, well, trees need to be planted, they need to grow, and they need to be monitored. So it's not just planting and then leaving it where they are, but with a long-term prospect. Next, please. And in three main dimensions, which is the forest, new forest, restored forest, agroforestry, and cities. Putting together all actors which are relevant in the sector. And the next one will, and last slide, will basically show you what the Commission intends to do with a roadmap to this objective of planting 3 billion additional trees by 2030, with guidelines, with political support, with a communication toolkit, with information on funding, and with a counter that the European Environment Agency is setting up. It's called Map My Tree, where people will be able to report their planting, and this will be counted under the European Commission EA monitoring counter. So this is actually, in a nutshell, in 9 minutes 40 seconds, the EU forest strategy. I'll be delighted to discuss and try to reply to your questions. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Marco. You're getting a gold star from me from a timekeeping perspective. Very impressive to go through in such a good overview there of the new forest strategy. So thank you very much for that, Marco. And I'm delighted to see more and more questions are coming in. So we've a very invested and active and engaged audience, which is fantastic. And now I'm delighted to move on to our second speaker for this morning's webinar. I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew St. Ledger. Andrew is a native woodland specialist, sculptor and artist, and he is a biodiversity forestry officer with the Galway-based Centre for Environmental Living and Training, and he sits on the board of the state body, the Council for Forest Research and Development, and is the public relations officer and co-founder of the Woodland League. So Andrew, are you joining us from Galway? I'll hand over. Do we have you, Andrew? Are you there?
Just wondering, can you hear me?
It's a little bit. It's a little bit faint. Are you okay there? Can you?
Is the audio okay?
Yes, that's coming in a bit better now, Andrew. Yes, thank you.
It's yeah, thank you, and. Fáilte Roiz go léir a carta. Thanks to the Commission for the opportunity. But I'm getting echoes here.
Andrew, I think we're having some sound issues with you there.
I'll try to carry on.
Okay. Andrew, what we might do, if
or
that's
do you
okay,
want to move on?
Yeah,
Mark,
we might ask. Yeah, we might ask you.
Better connect.
Please, yes. If you want to leave and rejoin, and instead I might try to move on to Mark, if that's okay, and then we'll come back to you. So thank you, Andrew. So while we try to fix the sound and sound issues there with Andrew, I might jump to you, Mark, if that's okay. It's slightly changing the order, but I'm delighted to welcome you. Mark, ladies and gentlemen, is the Director of Forest Industries Ireland, the National Representative Organisation for the Forestry and Timber sector, and the FII supports the entire forestry and timber supply chain from nurseries, forest management companies to sawmills and panel board companies. And the FII is a trade association within Ibec. So Mark, a very warm welcome to you and thank you for jumping in. So I might invite you now to deliver your address. Thank you.
Thanks, Noelle. Thanks very much for having me, and indeed thanks to the European Commission for inviting me along. It was interesting. We had a radio check for this session yesterday afternoon, and Marco was making fun of me and saying that he could do up my presentation quite easily by just kind of crossing out what he'd said and saying the opposite. But I don't think we're quite there, and I'd like to compliment Marco and all of his colleagues in the European Commission on a really thoughtful strategy and well researched, and clearly the Commission and Marco and all of his colleagues have a huge amount of expertise across all of these areas that they're looking at, and the enhancement of European forests and biodiversity and all these things. So I'd like to be very complimentary in the first instance about the strategy. From a forest sector's point of view, there are a lot of positives in it, and there'd be some queries we'd have around it as well. So maybe if I just take you through those briefly, if I could. In terms of the positives, fundamentally this strategy recognizes the value of forests to us all. It recognizes the huge value that they have to our society, to our people, to our environment, and indeed to our economy. And it recognizes and it supports the need for greater afforestation. That's the planting of more trees, and indeed the 3 billion tree pledge, and the benefits that all of that new tree planting will bring, and the benefits of proactively managing our existing forests and enhancing them. And if we look at Ireland's forests and Europe's forests, they're already doing tremendous work for us all. In terms of carbon sequestration, they're already absorbing and sequestering 10% of all of Europe's CO2 emissions. If we look to Ireland, our forests in Ireland absorb and take care of about 70% of the emissions from all of our cars on our roads. So this is a very major contribution, clearly, in terms of the environment. They provide renewable building products. They provide recreation spaces for us all to enjoy, particularly perhaps for a lot of us over the last 18 months. And they provide employment and valuable products. So, our forests are really amazing. They're a real gift, and we should look after them. We should enhance them. We should manage them properly, and we should all benefit from them. We've seen a steady growth in the forests in Ireland, and we need to get back into that growth mode, I think. The strategy spends a lot of time talking about the value of timber products, and that is very, very important. It recognizes that there's considerable room for improvement in terms of the amount of timber products we use, particularly in our built environment, where timber products only have about a 3% market share. And we need to grow that and need to use more of these timber products because they lock away carbon. It's a renewable building product, and it displaces other more carbon intensive products. So not alone are our forests sequestering millions of tons of carbon as they grow, also when the products are produced, those products continue to lock away carbon. Now, we're not so good at that in Ireland. We tend to build a lot with masonry in Ireland, and we're doing a lot of work to try and encourage more timber building in Ireland. And the strategy also does very well in pointing out that we need to modernize our building regulations all across Europe and move with the times. As timber technology has moved on, we need to recognize that, look at our building regulations, and allow our architects and engineers to design and build more with wood. The strategy also points out that we need to accurately quantify the carbon store in these products. I think we're better today to quantifying the carbon store in our woodlands and in our forests, but we need to look at the products as well. And that's a very beneficial piece of the strategy. I'm also very interested in the discussion in the strategy on payments for ecosystem services. I think this is worthy of more exploration and could be a real boon to forest owners. But we do have to look at, where those payments would come from, and we need to look at, how much they would rely on tax transfers. So certainly woodland owners and farmers in Ireland, for example, would be very, very interested in this. But I think we're not just there yet. We also have to recognise that here in Ireland there are already, significant payments for planting native woodland, for example, which would have to be seen ostensibly as a payment for ecosystem services. So they're already there. But we need to look at how we actively encourage more afforestation by using those. The strategy also talks about voluntary carbon markets. These would rely on additionality and being able to prove additionality. But again, it's an area that has huge potential for the sector. So, we're glad to see it being discussed, being raised and being progressed by the European Commission in the strategy. So if we could just look briefly at some of the things that perhaps will concern the forest sector around the strategy, we feel that, running through it is a tone where there's a call for very major change. And we believe that perhaps it doesn't give enough credit to what's being done already, perhaps doesn't give enough credit to the sustainable forest management practices that are already in place in Ireland and all across Europe. And it seems to suggest that we haven't been going in the right direction. And as practitioners in the forest sector who are very environmentally conscious, we feel that, perhaps it's a little bit dismissive of all the gains that have already been made and all the quality of what we're doing already. So there's a lot of cause for change, perhaps without a good understanding of what that change could entail. And perhaps it doesn't fully understand the realities of getting forests planted, managing them sustainably. And it discusses preconditions, perhaps without fully understanding the implications of these. And we would say there's an element here of you can't have your cake and eat it. There's an element that if you put in place too many restrictions and preconditions, then there will be impacts in terms of, how our forests can be managed and how successfully we can encourage our farmers and other people in Europe to plant new forests. Because the economics of this are very, very important if we're going to grow and scale our forestry. And if we want our woodlands and forests to be really impactful for climate change, it has to scale. And without scale, we're going to miss out on a lot of the benefits. So some of the challenges, I think, are not fully understood in the strategy. Similarly, in terms of the bioeconomy, I think, when we're looking at forests as carbon sinks and the displacement of carbon-intensive building products and fossil fuels, you have to understand that forest management doesn't simply happen by itself. It requires substantial efforts, substantial expertise, substantial investments all through our sector, from our nurseries through to our forest managers, through to our sawmills, and all through. Significant investments are required to make these things happen properly. And then we would say, perhaps there's a little bit too much in this strategy in terms of trying to define, what products should be prioritized. And perhaps it fails to fully understand the complexity of the supply chain and the economic rationale for the diversified product streams that come from our forests. So there is a role and a place for all the products that come from our forests, and there's a reason why it has evolved in that way. And indeed, market realities will dictate that the highest value products are indeed the longest life products and are very, very good for capturing and storing carbon in the long term. But we feel that, the market takes care of a lot of that, and the realities of forest management take care of a lot of that. And perhaps it doesn't need, that guiding hand in terms of, forcing what way investments go and what way products go. So there are issues there around, understanding the realities on the ground and some of the complexities around managing forests and some of the challenges in terms of growing our forests. If I can turn briefly, I don't know how much time I have left, but briefly to look at Ireland, FII has a vision for the future of forestry. We're disappointed sometimes with some of the negative commentary we get in Ireland around the world of forestry. We don't assert that everything has been going perfectly, but the Irish forest sector, I'd like to point out, is progressive. It is open to change. So we have a 770,000 hectare forest, which has grown from close to zero. That forest is a 300 million ton carbon sink. It is a 2.3 billion part of our economy. It provides 12,000 jobs. Our forests are storing up, sequestering another 5 million tons of carbon dioxide every year. And all of this has been achieved on the basis of planting productive forests. And bear in mind that well over a third of all the trees being planted in Ireland today are broadleaf. So they're productive forests, but they're mixed and they're diverse. So we really need to get our afforestation rate back up in Ireland. And if we can do that, if we can get up to the government's target of 8,000 hectares, I think there's plenty in this for everyone. So let's do both. Let's plant woodlands for nature and biodiversity, but let's also plant diversified forests for timber and wood to build our homes and to grow our new bioeconomy products. And I don't think we can do one of these things without the other. We need to take a common sense approach, I think, to the future development of our forests. Most farmers and landowners need to see a financial return from their land. They can't afford to make no return from their only asset. So I'd be very worried about any strategy or any direction that takes us away from the ability of a landowner to generate an economic return, because I bring you back to the point about scalability. If we don't have new forests, we don't have scale, and we lose a lot of those benefits in terms of climate change. So our vision is planting of 8,000 hectares per annum, plenty of biodiversity and broadleaves, as well as conifers, a healthy timber market with lots of wood being used in our built environment. Our forest should be growing to become a 1 million hectare forest in Ireland and a carbon sink of 400 million tonnes by mid-century. We'd like to see farmers fully engaged with forestry. We'd like to see them understanding it as a really positive option on their farms, both for the environment and for their own income. We'd like to see proper support for forestry and woodlands in the Common Agricultural Policy. We'd like to see the general public being really supportive of our forests and really understanding their value, getting lots of benefit from them in terms of recreation that we all enjoy our forests for. We'd like to see our forests continue to clean our air and our water, critically important water quality. And we'd like to see forests being a welcome part of our landscape and contributing to the diversity of our landscape. So I suppose we're calling for progress. We're calling for realism at the same time. And we're calling for an understanding that forests are different all across the EU, and a common sense approach really to developing a strategy for Ireland and for the EU in terms of forest management, and a realization that there are trade-offs in this. You can't have absolutely everything, and going for one option does have an impact on other outputs. So let's not turn our back on what has been working, and we can and should do all kinds of forestry in Europe and plant the right tree in the right place for the right reason. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark, for that. And thank you for stepping in out of agenda and out of schedule. So thank you for that. And Andrew, delighted to see you back with us. I think the technical gremlins that maybe affected some of the platforms reached their way, but we're delighted to see you back with us. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah. And can you hear
Fantastic.
me?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay,
Loud
well,
and clear.
Thank you. And thanks, Mark. Thanks for that. Thank you again to the Commission for the opportunity here to talk about this important EU strategy. And just to make a point at the start about a comment from an EU official in July regarding the strategy, he said, if you want to serve three purposes with one tree, biodiversity, carbon sink and bioenergy, we need 3 trees. We need more trees, to be very blunt. Now, the environmental pillar would say to that, yes, we need the right tree in the right place, but with the right ecological close to nature management. It's not just as simple as, more trees. So that'd be the first point. The EU forestry strategy does recognise the importance of forests in their ability for mitigating the worst effects of threats from climate change and biodiversity destruction. It is the first EU vision that seeks to ensure forests will help tackle these major climate and biodiversity issues rather than exacerbate the problems. It does contain some encouraging elements, such as prioritizing protection of primary and old growth forests, our most important biological resources for forests and forest ecosystems. The target of planting 1 billion new trees across the EU is good, but again, it needs to be with the right management, and we need more details. What types of tree and for what purpose? The critique of clear felling as a harvesting methodology and a call to phase it out is a good step in the right direction. Steps to improve monitoring and planning for all forests. The skills fund promotion aspect of getting funding in for training. Proposing a legally binding instrument for ecosystem restoration. Payment for ecosystem services, again, that based on measured and monitored results, results-based. Again, a lot of positives in there. However, in our opinion, it doesn't go far enough, nor do we see how these better elements can be implemented across the EU in the absence of an EU forest law. It's further undermined by the fact that forestry, unlike agriculture, for instance, remains in the remit of member states to do as they wish. To quote Commissioner Janusz Wojciechowski, who launched the strategy, encouraging joint action, but to an extent that does not take away member competences and does not interfere with them. We would be concerned about that. It's pointless in the face of the huge demand for wood driven by the EU Renewable Energy Directive and the uncontrolled promotion of the bioeconomy at all costs. It's also disingenuous for the EU member states to call on Brazil and Indonesia to stop deforestation while opposing the original EU forest strategy proposal to closely monitor logging in Europe. It shows the EU is still in denial regarding the dire state of European forests, including, in some cases, Ireland's. The forest strategy proposes to remedy the monitoring problem with a new EU forest observation, reporting and data collection law. This has the potential for a much more informed and healthier debate on the state of EU forests. Unfortunately, following intense lobbying by the forest industry, the Commission is no longer linking this law to binding indicators, which would make it possible to track the health of all EU forests. To restore Europe's forests and start restoring biodiversity, the EU will need to move from monitoring to mandatory action. So increased harvesting and clear felling mean that Europe's forests are absorbing 15% less carbon dioxide than they were 20 years ago. And things are going downhill. Healthy biodiverse forests are being replaced by monocultures. An area larger than Greece, approximately 14.5 million hectares, is now covered by tree plantations. If current management practices continue unchecked, by 2050, the EU forest sink will be halved. This destructive major land change is also negatively impacting upon rural communities, privatizing profits and socializing costs to the local environment, damaging soil and water, causing flooding and fires, destroying local roads, affecting small businesses, and ultimately undermining sustainable rural development. EU forest funding is linked to cap payment schemes under a suite of diverse forestry measures, some of which, if taken up, can complement the EU forest strategy objectives. Unfortunately, in Ireland's case, we do not avail of this EU forest funding and instead fund forestry using public funds allowed under EU state aid rules. Once again, we see the Commission can only call upon member states to set up new payment schemes to inject adequate EU funds to the forestry sector to implement the aims of the EU forest strategy. It again demonstrates inadequacy of the forestry strategy and its role as a weak aspirational call to action. The environmental pillar does not believe the EU forestry strategy gives enough support or protection to people, nature and the climate across the EU, nor does it give enough support to foresters and forestry companies and contractors who want to transition away from, poorer forestry legacy ingrained behaviour and practices. To ensure the forest strategy works for people, nature and climate, it should do the following as proposed by FERN, the EU NGO concerned with monitoring EU forestry policy. It's got to include new initiatives to end bad industry practices and address the drivers of logging. It's got to set binding targets to restore biodiversity in managed forests with positive incentives for forest owners to deliver on clear ecological benchmarks. It must mandate EU-wide forest management plans with common indicators and reporting standards. It's got to use satellite data to produce annual dashboards on all EU forestry. It must create an EU expert group with broad stakeholder representation to discuss EU forest initiatives. And this has to have representation from civil society, academics, forestry actors, relevant forest ministries. There should be an open space for civil society to raise concerns and member state dialogues to debate EU forest policy. And lastly, we need to revise the Renewable Energy Directive and the Land Use and Land Use Change and Forestry LULUCF regulation. What impacts does the EU forest strategy have on Ireland's forestry policy? Ireland and the EU have declared a climate and biodiversity emergency, and it is now widely accepted that sustainably managed forests can contribute significantly to climate mitigation with biodiversity restoration and conservation benefits. The Irish government is planning to substantially increase forest cover with a new target to plant 8,500 hectares per annum over the coming years. The positive or negative impact that this new forestry in Ireland will have on climate mitigation and biodiversity will ultimately depend on a range of factors, such as where this afforestation takes place, the management model of forestry used, and the environmental safeguards that are implemented. In Ireland, we have an industrial tree farming model concentrated in a number of low populated counties, such as Clare, Mayo, Cavan, and Leitrim, having 30% among the highest area concentration of industrial plantations, with major negative consequences. A lot of this planting of extractive forestry is being incentivized by tax-free grants available by private investors, while the legacy of state blanket coniferization policy on upland peat soils is being maintained by Coillte, the Irish State Forestry Board, managing 7% of the public forest land area, with at least 6% of that under a clear-cut and replant regime made up of 90 to 95% non-native Sitka spruce. Much of this Coillte plantation area is on steep slopes using vertical drains, which cause flooding in the lowlands, especially after large clear felling. Under existing EU sustainable forest management treaties, Helsinki, Lisbon, etc., all member states were required to amalgamate all existing forest legislation into one Forestry Act, which reflects the objectives of those SFM treaties. The 1988 Forestry Act, which created Coillte, was left untouched and is therefore completely unfit for purpose regarding achieving the aims and objectives of the EU forestry strategy and the SFM treaties. The 88 Act predates the 1992 Rio Declaration on the Environment, from where the sustainable forest management principles originate. It has no provision for SFM and is primarily a primitive primacy of profit timber production by any means license. This is impacting on more than half of the total of 11% forest cover and is unacceptable, as well as being totally out of line with existing EU SFM treaties. The state and the forest industry is claiming these are legacy issues, as if the problem has vanished, and that afforestation now includes a 30% broadleaf element. One problem with this is that afforestation has gone off a cliff and was down to the worst figure in 60 years in 2020, with only 2,434 hectares planted, significantly lower than the target of 8,500 hectares. When this is added to ash dieback wiping out a large broadleaf area, with the continued reforestation on sensitive upland bogs with exotic conifers affecting 6% of total forest area, negatively impacting sensitive habitats, it doesn't make sense, and it doesn't tie in with the aspirations and aims of the EU forestry strategy. COFOR, the state research body in 2007, warned that a minimum afforestation of 10,000 hectares per annum was needed to stand still and balance out year on year higher harvesting rates. And ideally 15,000 to 20,000 hectares was necessary to ensure that our forest area increased, as well as delivering on carbon storage, timber biodiversity, etc. All commitments at EU and UN level. Regarding carbon storage from Ireland's forests, we are told by industry and by the Forest Service that the sector accounts for 3.8 million tonnes each year, while according to Teagasc, the National Farm Research Body projections, via their marginal abatement curve scenario for agricultural emissions reductions, they predict only 2.1 million tonnes of carbon between 2021 and 2030, based on their calculations of low afforestation and higher harvesting. And to assist carbon neutrality in agriculture, they say we need 20,000 hectares per year of afforestation, combined with management of organic soils. They go further and propose a national land use strategy is required that integrates farming and forestry, which the environmental pillar would also agree with. The National Parks and Wildlife Service is currently, or have said, forestry is currently a significant threat and pressure on habitats and species protected under the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive, while the Environmental Protection Agency said forestry is the greatest pressure nationally on our last remaining lakes and rivers of high ecological value. The indications are that unless there's a shift in forest policy, then the predominance of non-native plantations and the use of clear felling within Irish forestry will continue. So one of the most pressing concerns for the environmental pillar is that blanket afforestation of the inappropriate model referred to will be targeted on marginal agricultural land, particularly in areas where low intensity land uses, such as hill farming.
Sorry.
Yep.
Sorry, Andrew, to interrupt. I'm just conscious of time,
Sure.
and I'm going to use my yellow
Okay.
card, if I may.
That's all right.
Just with the level of questions are coming in. Could I maybe ask you just to wrap up? That would be
this
super.
marginal farmland contains some of the most important remaining areas for biodiversity in the country, including high status water bodies, protected semi-natural habitats, and high nature value farmland. Forestry is also the main pressure on threatened species like the hen harrier. So customized agroforestry options with riparian woodlands and ecological corridors focused on our native species and hedgerows should be incentivized and sensitively applied on all farms for the known multiple benefits. In our view, the Irish forestry policy and strategy must be coherent with our biodiversity and landscape protection commitments, and also be compliant with legal obligations on habitats and species, air quality, water quality, climate change, landscape, and transnational boundary impacts. We also note that a Green Party forestry bill in 2019 containing some of these elements at the time was supported by a majority in the Dáil, showing there is a growing public and political mandate for an overdue seismic shift in Ireland's forestry policy to ensure it is aligned with the national EU and UN climate mitigation plans. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. And we'll go straight into the questions because we have got a lot of questions in. So I really want you, the panel, to have a chance to answer our audience's questions for you. So the first question came in from Sean O'Conlawn. And Sean is saying that there is a growing movement away from short cycle, 30 years approximately, monoculture forestry to continuous cover close to nature managed woodlands. Trees grown in Ireland could have lives which span several generations of forest owners. Current policies don't seem to consider the profound social and economic implications. Could the panel comment? Mark, do you want to take that first and then maybe Marco?
Sure. So, this question points to, I suppose, the great debate in Irish forestry and indeed forestry across Europe at the moment. And that's around what type of trees we're growing henceforth. So, listen, the sector's belief is that we can have healthy forests, we can have diverse forests, we can have resilient forests, and we can have productive forests. So we can do all of these things if forests are being sustainably managed. What is very, very challenging is to have any sort of level of new afforestation at scale. That scale that'll give us the carbon benefits unless you have a common sense, sensible approach to what type of trees you're looking to plant. So absolutely, you know, biodiversity, healthy forests, a mix of species, the right trees planted in the right soils, in the right parts of the country. All of these are crucial. Nobody wants to see forests that are not, you know, absolutely as beneficial as they can be for the environment. But there has to be a common sense approach. Otherwise, you run the risk of having no new forests, or certainly very, very few new forests. And I don't think we want to get into that situation. That has huge costs for our society, for our people, for our environment. And that's, you know, there are trade-offs in this.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Marco, did you want to come in on that?
Very briefly, I mean, we are convinced because we see experiences in Europe that it is beneficial not only to the environment to have these longer cycles, no clear cuts, biodiverse forests, no monoculture, close to nature forestry or continuous cover forestry. That is also better for the economy. It's the principles, for instance, of pro silva, which are principles of close to nature forestry, if I may simplify. They have a reason in the context of the economy. That is an association that has realized that applying this principle would be better for their pockets in the end, not just for the environment. So we are convinced that this is possible. It's in some cases a cultural thing. In some cases, it requires changes. As Mark very rightly said before, it doesn't happen overnight. You need to implement the changes and take some accompanying measures. But we think that this is actually the future. Great.
Thank you, Marco. And Andrew, I might put the next question to you, if I may. And it has come in from Neil Fuchs. And apologies, Neil, if I have mispronounced your surname. And Neil is asking, in reference to carrying out logging during bird nesting period must comply with the Birds Directive as part of the EU Forest Strategy. Currently, there are no general seasonal restrictions on felling activity in Ireland. The birds case is still open. What changes do the panel envisage will be required to ensure that Ireland complies with Article 5 of the Birds Directive and the issues raised in the birds case? Andrew, are you familiar with that?
I think it's a question directed maybe towards the industry, but the fact that, you know, harvesting, clear felling can occur during bird nesting season, while simultaneously, you know, hedgerows cannot be cut, is a major anomaly, and it's like it doesn't make any sense, and you know, until we have a forestry model that is compatible with nature and with, for instance, bird nesting, we're still a long way away from having sustainable forest management. And, you know, basically there should not be any harvesting done during bird nesting season. And, you know, if it's in breach of the EU Birds Directive, well, that needs to be brought to a head and rectified.
Great, thank you, Andrew. We have a question in here from Senator Alice Mary Higgins, and Senator Higgins is actually also one of the Oireachtas nominees to the Conference on the Future of Europe, and she's wondering, so maybe Marco, this one might be for you. How can the new EU forestry strategy ensure the maximum diversity in forest types in member states? Is there a role for the Conference on the Future of Europe to strengthen this? And are rules on hedgerows part of it? And if so, how can we strengthen them?
Well, very interesting question. Thank you. The strategy is a communication, and as such is non-binding, gives directions. It's up to the member states then to let's say, to work out the best solutions which are considered best to fulfill these principles, but adapted to the local level. So we are going to, in the strategy, adopt these guidelines on close to nature forestry, on biodiversity-friendly afforestation, and of course there is a strong push for more biodiverse strategies, no monocultures, no clear cut, or limitation of clear cuts, and so on. How can the future review conference support that? I think the best way is to highlight the political importance of healthy forests, because healthy forests are crucial because they are at the heart of both climate and biodiversity crisis, and a healthy forest is good for the economy as well. So I think that what the EU forest strategy has done is a little bit recentered. In fact, it's a forest strategy, not a forestry strategy. It's a forest strategy. It's a strategy for forests that for the first time has put, and this is also why it's been worked out by these three services together in the Commission, agriculture, environment, climate, has put these three elements more, let's say, together than it was in the past, highlighting not only the need of better integration, but also the urgency of acting, because this is also the problem. What Mark said before is also very right. You need time, but we don't have time to face the crisis that we have. And I think that in this sense, the future of Europe can help in that, in convincing that we need more Europe for this. Forest is an EU competence because it's climate and environment. It's not only member states' competence. But we need to have common solutions, and this is very much at the heart of the future of Europe.
Great, thank you, Marco. Andrew, I see you want to come in on that point.
Yeah, just briefly, Europe could help, with transition funding to allow for, the in the case of Ireland to compensate for time to introduce continuous cover. And to do it in 5-year kind of cycles where existing plantations can be converted over time, and the clear felling reduced down to smaller areas, and in 5-year cycles that allow the species diversity to come in to allow for natural regeneration. But there is a problem going back to the state forestry company occupying 6% of the land on sensitive upland areas, in that the shallow root system of the Sitka spruce and the composition of the peat don't really allow for continuous cover forestry. You have wind throw issues, and that needs careful attention and planning to allow for maybe a mosaic landscape to come in of some birch, some of the native species or upland species, again being sensitive to existing habitats, but that's some kind of a transition there and assistance for the state to do that. And for the Forestry Act also needs to be changed to instruct Coillte to do what needs to be done after careful planning. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And our next question has come in from Donald Whelan of the Irish Timber Growers Association. And Donald has stated that the recently launched EU Forest Strategy states the recommendations to member states on the CAP strategic plans have encouraged due consideration of forests. Member states received specific recommendations on forests and the forestry sector. Further in the document, it outlines that this will involve the Commission and consequently the CAP strategic plans promoting forest-related remuneration schemes in an action plan for both carbon farming and carbon removal certification to be adopted by the end of 2021. And Donald's question is, how can the current draft interventions as proposed by Ireland in the draft CAP interventions assist achieving this EU forest strategy aim and other core aims of the EU forest strategy? Mark, I might ask you to comment first on that, and then maybe Marco and Andrew if you wanted to come in after.
Yeah, well, Donald makes a very good point there. We have to get the CAP right. And as everybody knows, the CAP is in play at the moment with a new strategy for next year. At the moment, and historically, the CAP has been a negative for forestry. Lands are being locked away in various cap agri-schemes, agri-environmental schemes, and they're locked away, and farmers can't then make a decision later on to plant. So we have an ongoing conversation now with the European Commission and with our own Department of Agriculture officials about this, and it has to be got right, and it has to be got right in the next number of months. So we have to build the flexibilities in and really follow through on what the European Commission is asking Ireland and all the other member states to do, and that is actively encourage and facilitate tree planting and the management of woodlands under the cap. And I just think the thinking in Ireland is, I'm sad to say, is still a long, long way away from doing that. I think we can effectively integrate the cap with our national forestry programme. I think the European Commission would like to see us doing that. I think we can incentivise planting under Pillar 2 and fund that through the national forestry programme. I don't see any reason why that can't be done. So I'm delighted to see the Commission really pushing for this. I think, we need better joined up thinking here in Ireland, and we need to get creative about this. It's done in other countries, but the cap is very live. And if we get it wrong, it's going to have a major impact on the amount of trees we get planted in the next number of years.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Marco, did you want to comment on that?
I'm not so much into the CAP strategic plan for Ireland, but I think that what Mark said is absolutely right, and we are recommending. Member states have a lot of more flexibility now under the new CAP, so it's crucial the way the CAP strategic plans will develop, and this is actually highlighting the forest strategy. So I think the comment that was made before the question, also by the person that put the question, is very good.
Great. Andrew, did you want to come in on that?
Yes. I think in the absence of Ireland actually taking direct funding for forestry, for its forest programme from under CAP, which it doesn't look likely to do, well then the forest aspects, that Mark refers to in Pillar 2, where it could be funded, probably needs to come in under agroforestry and to be taken away from forestry, and to be taken away from forestry law in Ireland, which restricts farmers and puts a lot of farmers off, where 0.1 of a hectare, a very small area, license is required, and there's a replanting obligation, which puts off many farmers, whereby if there was a flexibility for farmers to plant small areas, which I think there is a move towards, and if that flexibility, on condition, again, they're not in Natura sites or SACs or NHAs. For instance, in Northern Ireland, on the same island, there's a farmer can plant 5 hectares without it being, or I think it's 5 acres, or hectares, maybe. Sorry, I need to check that, but it's either 5 acres or 5 hectares without it coming under, forestry definition, without it being seen as a land use change. So again, coming back to the LULUCF, we need flexibility in land use change to look at beneficial land use change in small areas on farms to reduce the restrictions and encourage kind of adult behavior, in that once the farmer sees the benefits and reaps the benefits of agroforestry in regard to long-term permanent woodland on the farm, that they won't ever want to remove it anyway. So that replanting obligation shouldn't be imposed.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And ladies and gentlemen, we have a huge range of questions coming in. So if I may thank the panel in advance, they've kindly agreed to stay on just for us to try and get through a few more. So thank you for that. And the next question that has come in is from Brendan Fitzsimons. And Brendan's question is, he is commenting that 3 billion trees planted between today and 2050 are only 1 million hectares if entirely new afforestation. This seems like a tiny amount spread across the EU. Even Ireland, with the lowest forest cover in Europe, has that much forest. This seems almost more like a gesture than a serious policy to combat climate change. Marco, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, the target is not 2050, it's 2030. So it's 300 million additional trees per year. I agree. I mean, it's a symbolic pledge, but it's very ambitious, because we have estimated, because it's very difficult to have exact figures, that in the last 10 years, there has been an increase every year about 280 million trees. That means over 10 years, we had 2.8 billion trees more in the last 10 years. And the idea of the pledge is to double that. That's why it's called the 3 billion additional trees. So we must make it very clear. If you harvest and replant, that does not count, because that is not additional. So replanting after harvesting is not counted. Okay, what the European Commission would like to do is would like to double the business as usual growth of trees that happens anyway, with this additionality principle. 300 million trees per year in the next 10 years. It is actually relatively ambitious, because there is an issue, of course, of competition for land. We don't want to take land out of agriculture and make agriculture even more intensive than what already is. We can't plant trees where there is valuable biodiversity or land like peatland. I mean, there is a big issue ongoing in Ireland because of this legacy and planting in peatland. So of course we don't want to make that worse. So that's why I showed in the beginning we have these three areas: forest wherever this makes sense, but agroforestry, which is a big, let's say, fertile ground for planting trees, and also urban areas. But I believe that this is relatively ambitious.
Okay, thank you, Marco. And next question has come in from MEP Luke Flanagan, and he is asking, could the panel comment on the change to land eligibility in the CAP strategic plan, which allows for agroforestry as an eligible practice? So maybe Mark, Andrew, do you want to take that? Mark, did you want to come in on that?
I'm not entirely clear what Luke Flanagan is driving at there in terms of agroforestry. Agroforestry is an eligible scheme under our national plan. Absolutely, it could be linked into the CAP, as Andrew mentioned earlier. It's probably an ideal sort of thing to be linked into Pillar 2, as would the planting of native woodlands linked into Pillar 2 in small areas. Andrew also pointed to the need to deconstruct some of the licensing requirements around planting very small areas of native woodlands. We'd like to see that as well. Some of the thinking here is aligned between all of the different parties, and we'd all be calling for, let's look at the art of the possible here. And absolutely, let's allow farmers to do more agroforestry. Let's incentivize that. Let's incentivize, the planting of small plots of native woodland. Just if I can just briefly give you a stat going back to the 3 billion tree pledge. I mean, if our FII's vision for forestry comes to pass, and we get to this 1 million hectare forest in Ireland alone would be planting 625 million more trees by mid-century. So that's a lot of trees. The trick is actively trying to get there.
Okay, yes. Just to say that the agroforestry has been, a suite of agroforestry measures have existed within the rural development regulation for many years. Ireland was very, very slow to introduce an agroforestry measure, and the measure they've chosen from this large suite of options is a very narrow timber focused one. So we're not flexible enough. We need to widen the options in regard to how we adopt agroforestry. And agroforestry is a key to basically to the biodiversity, to the forests in Ireland, accessing the multiple benefits of forestry. For instance, if just 5% of all farmland, and farmland's occupying 86% of the land of Ireland, which is a problem in terms of that's really the only lands available for putting trees on. Well, if 5%, which is not a huge amount, we have 4%, we go from 11% low tree cover, we go to 15%, we gain 4% in tree cover, which is a massive gain. And that would also compensate for the 3.8% loss of hedgerow and scrub between the years 2011 and 2017, which is a massive loss of carbon, biodiversity, etc. And we need to do that, urgently. And coming back to, you know, the EU forest strategy, emphasis on old growth and primary forests, you know, these should be, again, targeted for expansion using natural regeneration. That's the right tree in the right place, not planting. Planting uses a lot of energy. It uses, you know, not just human energy, but also carbon energy. Nature itself, if given the right opportunities, and in Ireland it means fencing, fenced off areas around our 0.02% of ancient forests, woodlands, to allow them expand themselves into areas, encourage landowners, state and private and farmers, to allow the forest to come back in, and to join them by ecological corridors and create linear ecological biodiversity, you know, rich native forests and woodlands right through the land and right away across Europe. That should be our priority, consolidating the most valuable forests and trees that we have and making the most of them. And, you know, then to look at diversifying and improving our, you know, timber production has to occur alongside this, but not to the detriment, you know.
Okay.
There needs to be a balance between the ecological forests that we need, the economic forests, and then social forests. We need more community woodlands, and they could also be, the community woodlands can be created along these corridors, and again become biodiversity and social community beneficial areas for employment, for, you know, training, for learning, for outdoor classrooms. There's massive opportunities there, especially in Ireland. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. And actually, I think, Andrew, you've answered some part of the next person's question, Daniel O'Donoghue from SWS Forestry, and he has asked whether the panel believes there will be any form of financial incentive in the next 5 years for forest owners for the environmental benefits of their forestry. Can they address carbon, biodiversity, and environmental separately? I think Andrew has touched upon that really well. Mark or Marco, did either of you want to come in on that question?
Maybe just very briefly, there is a carbon farming initiative coming up, which is precisely intended for that. So yes, I hope that there will be more opportunities in the next 5 years for the environment. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd echo that as well. I think you know, there's huge potential in this payments for ecosystem services, both in terms of diversifying incomes for farmers, but also in terms of, you know, what they're aimed at, which is creating biodiversity and enhancing our forests. So, you know, it's sort of a nascent area. There have been various pilots in various parts of Europe, as identified in the strategy. Our own Farmers Association, you know, give a lot of credence to this, and I'd support that as well. So, but it's something that needs work, and of course the question is, you know, where do the payments come from? You know, if it's not from selling carbon on a voluntary carbon market, then the payments effectively become transfers from, you know, the EU taxpayer. Now, you know, there are benefits for that, and maybe it's worthwhile. But listen, I think it's worth, you know, further exploration and driving on with it.
Great, thanks. And because I'm very conscious, some people have submitted 6 questions each, so I want to try and be fair to everyone and at least pick one question from people. So Conal Joyce has said that some policymakers and MEPs have argued that there is no such thing as one single European forest, and that introducing an EU-wide forest strategy cannot possibly take account of regional differences from one part of the continent to the next. With that in mind, is the introduction of such a strategy counterproductive to the ultimate aim of getting more trees in the ground to tackle climate change? Marco?
I would disagree, because it's precisely what the forest strategy says. The forest strategy, it recognizes fully the diversity of European forests. It brings about a number of principles which are common, of objectives which are common, but it's a strategy. Then it's the implementation of the strategy is for the member states. There will be guidelines, as I said, on close to nature forestry, on afforestation, on mapping old growth forests. but the, let's say, day-to-day management of the forest in the member states would be within these principles, which at the moment are not binding, would be for the member states. Let's not forget that we have quite a lot of legislation on forests since many years. We have the nature legislation, the Birds Directive and the Habitat Directive. We have the Invasive Alien Species Regulation. We have the LULUCF regulation. All this legislation, since many years, has already created a level playing field of forest management in Europe. So in that sense, the EU forest strategy doesn't change anything. It just, puts forests in a different perspective. For what I said before, for the new, for the urgency of acting under the two crises. But from the point of view of competence, Europe has always been active on forests, and member states have always accepted that. So in that sense, the EU forest strategy cannot be counterproductive.
Okay, thank you, Marco, for that. And the last question, because Owen Jordan has submitted many questions. So Owen, I'm going to take the moderator's choice here and pick a question. And one of his questions is, in terms of, at the moment, we're struggling to get forests planted in Ireland due to a licensing crisis, which has hampered the industry for nearly 2 years now. Will more restrictive practices not make uptake in forestry even harder? Mark, Andrew, did you want to comment on Owen's question there?
Yeah. Listen, this is at the crux of it, really. I welcome what Marco has just said about, the EU not wanting to kind of have a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's not what the forest strategy is about. I think that's very important. But the crux of it, really, here in Ireland is we have a licensing crisis. We need regulatory change. It's the industry's firm belief that unless we change our regulatory system, we won't have a system that can cope. The current system is not able to cope. So we need that regulatory change. And that regulatory change should and can, absolutely respect all of the relevant EU legislation and all of the relevant, environmental needs and goals. But we do need to create a situation where we're actively incentivizing new forest creation, new woodland creation of all different types, all different species, productive forests, for nature forests, all of these different things. That is at the crux of it. And if we get into too much restrictions and too much in the way of guidance and rules and regs around exactly what has to be done, how those forests have to be managed, I think we're going to struggle even more than we already are in terms of planting new forests. So we have to get this regulatory system right, and then we have to create the right sort of incentives and allow the forest economy the flexibility that it needs to grow and diversify and prosper.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Andrew, I'll give the last word to you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. First and foremost, a truly sustainable, ecologically managed forest will not impact negatively on water, on soil, on birds, on wildlife. It will enhance all of those things. And it will also enhance local communities. It will enhance the economy, as Marco pointed out. And the reason forestry is so important to sustainable development, and the reason it has its own set of principles linked to the 1992 Rio Declaration on the Environment, is for that very reason, that when it's done properly, it has multiple benefits that touch on the social, the economic, and the environmental. It's, the stool, sustainable development is referred to as a three-legged stool. And forestry done well and done properly supports the stool with the social leg, the environmental leg, and the economic leg in balance. The licensing issues in Ireland come back to problems of under-regulation, a failure to regulate, a failure to see coming down the line that the EU directives were eventually going to catch up with failure to implement them or failure to uphold them. The Forest Service didn't have enough ecologists, for instance, and has only started to employ them in the last year, 20 ecologists up from 1. So it's a little too little too late. Warnings were given regarding unsustainable practices and how, numerous occasions, and many hours of volunteers' time spent making complaints and going to Europe, and Europe being unable to actually really act or do much about it, because again, the forestry comes back to member states' competence, which comes back to our point at the outset. We also need an EU forest law, and we can't leave it to member states' competence. And in the case of Ireland, that we have legacy issues going back years and years and years that have now come back to haunt us, and that's causing problems for everybody. And nobody wants those problems, but we are where we are, as they say. So there is we need to acknowledge the problems, the issues, and then start to transition towards amending and move to a truly sustainable forestry model that can balance the three legs of that stool. We're not doing it. We have a long way to go. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you all very much. And I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, while it's very clear from the level of interest, engagement, and questions we're still getting in, and apologies to everyone, we just didn't get time ran out against us, and we've already gone over the allocated schedule. So, with thanks to our speakers for kindly staying on, it was fantastic to hear their comments, their thoughts, and a really wide-ranging debate and conversation. And if I may, on behalf of all of us watching online, thank our speakers this morning, to Marco, Andrew, and Mark, for your time, for your insights and your wisdom on a topic that I have no doubt we will be returning to, given its importance for our climate and environment. And I think that's the big takeaway that I am leaving today with. If I could also thank our colleagues in the European Commission representation here in Ireland for today's event, and of course my own team in EM Ireland. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in, for all your questions and your comments and your remarks. I think this has been one of the most interactive webinars we've done, given the level of interest there, and it's fantastic to see that. So thank you very much, and until we meet again, either virtually or hybrid or in person, who knows at this stage, but good to see that hopefully we are turning the corner on things. If I may, thank you all once more. A very good morning. Tuarara, take care. Agus slán go fóill. Thank you. Bye-bye.